Hi everyone. For those who don't know me, my name's Toby Underwood. I'm the Accreditation and Careers Manager at the RSC. I'd like to introduce you to this YouTube recording, which has been suggested by you, the chemistry community. The idea is that we help break some myths surrounding accreditation during the COVID pandemic. Much of this information is already available on an FAQ document on our website, www.rsc.org. We hope by doing this verbally, we can provide reassurance to you and support what's out there. The aim for accreditation remains to primarily support students to ensure they receive the skills they need for future careers. And as such, employers are also a key stakeholder. However, we do realise during the pandemic, we need a sense of realism and also support departments in what's feasible. We hope that this has been done up to now, and we have heard from many of you about the guidance we've already provided and how helpful it's been. More recently, since the start of the year, another lockdown has occurred and things have changed again. We hope to address any new concerns during this recording. And as such, I'd like to introduce Professor David Smith, who many of you know, and is the chair of the Royal Society of Chemistry's Committee for Accreditation and Validation. David.
Thanks, Toby. Yes, my name is David Smith. My day job is as Faculty Education Director in the Faculty of Science at the University of Bristol. But obviously my background is in chemistry. And I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to be able to, in conversation with Toby, to be able to explain some of the flexibility that we have in accreditation and the ways in which we can support the rest of the chemistry community.
Thank you, David. So going straight into the first question. Many departments are struggling to maintain practical hours. Could you clarify, David, the minimum number of practical hours needed per year to maintain accreditation?
Yeah, sure. So practical competence is an essential requirement for accreditation. It's one of the reasons, for example, why we would always make sure that a student must complete and pass their practical course in a normal time. And that practical experience needs to be a meaningful one. So historically, we've always used practical hours as a proxy for the quality of that experience. And it's not a perfect indicator. We're doing some work as a committee to explore the skills and the competencies that we expect students to develop. But that concept of minimum number of practical hours has been very useful in the past in maintaining standards, especially when departmental facilities, for example, have been threatened. So we usually expect bachelor's students to complete 300 hours of practical work and integrated master's students 400 hours across their entire program. That's separate, of course, from any project work. And we're also flexible about placement programs and where we have or with joint honours programs with other scientific disciplines. And these are meant to be but we recognise, of course, and I think, as you said, that it's going to be very challenging under the current circumstances for some students to achieve those hours. And departments have been very creative in replacing some practical activities with simulations, with take-home experiments, and so on. And we think that those activities, those virtual activities, have a real place to play, and they could replace as much as 25% of the total practical hours across the programme without compromising the standards and the employability of students. But they can't replace the practical experience completely. So there isn't a substitute for some real hands-on lab experience. And I think, as I tried to emphasise, it's important to note that students need to meet those standards across the programme rather than within any individual year of study. So ideally, students will perform their practical work alongside their taught courses, but this year that isn't necessarily possible. So a reduction of practical hours this year could be in year more than 25%, as long as across the entire programme that experience of practical work is still met.
Okay, thanks, David. You mentioned virtual and online practicals there. Can you give a bit more of a feeling for how much of the replacement is allowed? Is there a number there?
Yeah, okay. So for a bachelor student, if you assume that all the routine practical work is done in the first 2 years, I know that's not necessarily the case in all degree programmes, so it's 150 hours per year, then 25% of the total would equate to 50% of the practical hours in any one year. So we're talking about a reduction of about 75 hours in year, as I say, because we'd be looking at the total across the programme. But I think the important thing to note is that doesn't necessarily mean that 75 hours of practical lab experience needs to be replaced by 75 hours of virtual lab experience. So the emphasis needs to be on ensuring that students are still able to get the experience and develop the necessary competencies rather than a like-for-like replacement. And I'm really aware that online learning can seem relentless. It certainly can be for students. So we would want departments to think about student workload as well, and not just replace those hours by an equivalent number of hours spent on virtual activities.
Okay. So I get a feeling that from an accreditation point of view, we consider it across the whole programme as rather than a year or a snapshot in time.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And whilst ideally under normal times we want the practical work to be sequenced and integrated with the rest of the programme, these are not normal times and we would need to be flexible. And the important thing for us is ensuring that when students graduate, they've been exposed to the experiences in the lab that they need, have developed the skills and techniques and knowledge of the techniques. And unfortunately, right now, the challenge will be to fit that into the entire degree programme. So there may be significant changes within 1 year of study, but actually the thing that we're most interested in is that students meet those outcomes by the end of their degree programme.
Okay, thanks, David. So we're also hearing from students about the concerns about the virtual and online practicals and how they're not replacing the real thing and potentially harming their job prospects in the future. Can you comment on that at all?
Yes, and I understand that as being a concern, and that's one of the reasons why we would want to make sure that where virtual activities replace lab time, that it's a meaningful replacement, and it will still provide students with the experience that they need. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are some things that it's very difficult and in many cases impossible to replace a hands-on experience by a meaningful virtual experience. And we've lent a lot on the experience, for example, of one of our industrial representatives on the Committee for Accreditation and Validation, who has helped to give us that employer insight into making sure that when we look at the plans that individual departments have, they will still ensure that students have the skills and the experiences to be competitive, not only this year, but to compete with other students from other cohorts. And that they will still be competitive in the job market.
Thanks, David. And I'm sure that you and the rest of the committee must have seen some pretty innovative ideas on how to make practicals happen this year. Is there anything that stands out?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there are all sorts of very innovative and very creative approaches that departments have taken. So these range from using simulations, either simulations that they've developed themselves, through to simulations that can be brought in from external providers, from video clips that demonstrate techniques that students might otherwise get the chance to perform themselves. At least they get the chance to see someone else being able to perform them. They can be tremendously valuable as well. And then, of course, also activities where the challenge is perhaps not necessarily operating the instrument itself or performing the experiment, but in analysing the data and interpreting the data. So there have been some really good examples of departments who provided students with data from previous experiments and maybe getting them to do some collaborative group work, which often isn't possible, and enrich the experience that way. I think we've also seen some really neat ideas where some universities have got students, especially in the earlier years of the programme, maybe in first year, to do some almost take-home chemistry, and which will introduce them perhaps more to the scientific method rather than necessarily the equipment that they would encounter in a state-of-the-art chemistry lab.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot. I suppose it's important for me to say that the RSC, the Royal Society of Chemistry, remains supportive for all, and especially those within our membership. So I would encourage people to keep an eye on various grants and other types of funding that are available, and we are continually reassessing that. So please just keep going back, and I would encourage you to get your students to do the same, because there might be opportunities coming up. So David, moving on to the next topic, which is final year projects. What happens if a master's student has started a project and now in the lab last term and are now suddenly being forced can't go into the lab anymore? Is there anything you can say there?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a real issue. So our expectations for projects vary with the level of accreditation, and bachelor's students are expected to perform independent investigative work, and that doesn't need to be in a traditional research lab as part of a conventional research project. So it could, for example, be a dissertation, or it could be a schools-based project where students go out into schools. The requirements for integrated master's students are rather different, and they do need to undertake research training and complete what would be a potentially publishable project. So there's no requirement for students to perform a practical project in either case. And so many students in normal years have been performing excellent theoretical chemistry projects where they don't necessarily go into the lab, and they remain a valid experience even now. So a student not being able to go into a lab now is not necessarily a problem for accreditation, because it's never been a requirement for accreditation on either a bachelor's or an integrated master's program. But I think the challenge is actually for integrated master's students who've started out on a practical project that they can't complete. And a literature review can form part of a final report, for example, if it's balanced by evidence of some of the initial own independent research work. But it will be difficult for these students to change tack midway through their project, and then still be able to demonstrate that they've met the high level expectations for what we would expect for a student working at essentially a master's level. I think the position for finally a bachelor's students is especially unfortunate, because it's hard to argue the case that those students have to have access to research facilities, because it's not a requirement in accreditation that they need to produce a potentially publishable project. But even so, there will be lots of bachelor students who are doing research projects working alongside integrated master's students and other researchers who will now have only a limited prospect of completing what they'd expected. So I think in both cases, we're acutely aware of the issues that these students are facing, and they're very diverse in the challenges that they've got. And what we'll do as a committee for accreditation and validation, and through the Royal Society of Chemistry, is continue to use what influence we've got to support these students and make sure that they're not disadvantaged by any ongoing restrictions on access to facilities.
Okay, thanks, David. It's worth pointing out there as well that we are aware that letters have been written by the government to students and to departments and to universities around this subject. And we as the professional body for the chemical sciences have responded to that. And we have written to the ministers or the minister themselves asking for some clarity, and also to students as well, to help them realise that we are supporting them in their endeavours.
Yeah, and Toby, just to chip in there, and I think anything we could do for individual departments who wanted some support in how that the existing guidance is interpreted, we'd be very willing to provide that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, David. Now, there's another obvious point here as well, and we know some students, even when the labs reopen, will hesitate and obviously be concerned and may not even want to go into the labs. Can you comment on anything around that?
Yeah, and we do have to recognise that this is going to be a problem. So in what we've talked about so far is about departments ensuring that the opportunities are available, thinking about a cohort and how they might meet those programme level outcomes. And I think we've talked a little bit about replacing lab hours with virtual experiments, but even then there may be some challenges. And I know some departments have already been contemplating alternatives, especially if the local or national lockdown restrictions continue. So some have been talking about possibilities to delay practical work to subsequent years. And that's not ideal, and it could be challenging for some departments to implement, but it would still meet accreditation requirements. It'd probably mean that some material from subsequent years would have to be brought forward, or maybe even lost to make space in the curriculum. But I think in terms of accreditation, as long as the depth of understanding isn't compromised, it should be possible to sacrifice maybe some of that breadth in order to make sure that the practical experience is maintained. And I know other departments have discussed intensive summer courses, either at the end of the year or just before the start of the next academic year. And thinking about particularly what you were saying there, I think that might be possible for the small number of students who have either chosen to study or been unable to study on campus for any of this year, or who might now decide that they don't want to return if restrictions are eased. And it may well be possible to provide those sorts of intensive lab courses over the summer for students. I think it's much more challenging for departments to provide that for entire cohorts if there are large numbers of students that don't return. And I'm thinking as much about the technical and academic staff who would have to support those classes over the summer. And they've been working flat out throughout the pandemic and deserve a break over the summer. And I'm conscious that our remit in terms of accreditation is to preserve standards for students and for employers. But we also have to recognise our responsibility to the staff who deliver that teaching. And many of those are RSE members. And I think very much the approach that we're taking now is not to expect departments to have a firm concrete plan in place for how they will support the students who don't meet those requirements yet. But we would want to work through, not least because it's not clear when restrictions might be eased or what will happen for the rest of the year. So we want to work with them to make sure that they can develop the plans for this summer and for subsequent years. But I think fundamentally, there have always been some students who, through illness or personal circumstances, haven't always been able to complete every element of a degree programme and do every single experiment that's been set, for example. And we would normally consider those as universities on a case-by-case basis through our extenuating circumstances processes and so on. And departments should continue to use their discretion over those students, but also recognise that for some students, it may be fundamentally very challenging for them to catch up. And it will be difficult for departments if students progress and they've got students in one particular cohort with very different experiences.
And accreditation aside, moving on sort of the learning outcomes, is it natural to assume that learning outcomes will still need to be met to achieve degrees, to graduate?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. We've been talking mostly about accreditation, but there is also a risk that if students don't have access to facilities, for example, that it won't be possible for them to meet the intended learning outcomes for their programme. And that's obviously a challenge for the particular institution. So in what we've been doing, I still think that the priority for departments should be to ensure that students can still achieve those intended learning outcomes, just maybe not quite in the way that was originally intended. And I think where that turns out not to be possible, we'll expect departments to work with their students to ensure that they're content with any changes to their program structure and the intended learning outcomes that can then be achieved. And we will expect, if departments modify degree programs, we will want to review those to make sure that they still meet the requirements for accreditation.
That makes sense, thank you. And looming on the horizon, well, departments are currently in an examinations phase already, but looming on the horizon is summer examinations. Can you provide any comments on assessments and how that impacts accreditation?
Yeah, and departments are actually, like with practical work, they've been equally creative about assessment, and they've found some really great alternatives to conventional invigilated exams. And as a committee for accreditation and validation, we're not prescriptive about forms of assessment, The most important thing is that the assessment is appropriate for the intended learning outcomes that are being assessed, and it's obviously that it's rigorous. One example is many universities have used open note exams that have been taken remotely, and they can be a really good way of assessing student understanding, but not necessarily assessing knowledge, because students can then just look things up either in their notes or on the web. So that's a case where open note exams are perfectly acceptable, provided that they're relevant to and appropriate for the intended learning outcomes being assessed. And I think what I would say is that in devising those alternative forms of assessment, departments really need to minimise the opportunities for collusion, for example. So thinking about the rigour, unless of course the activity was intended in the first place as group work. And they should also think about student well-being. So I know that one possible alternative that has been suggested for replacing conventional examinations has been 24-hour assessments. And I think for us as a committee, we discourage departments from thinking about 24-hour assessments, primarily because our experience shows that if students are given 24 hours to complete an assessment, many of them will actually spend 24 hours in performing that assessment, which is not necessary and certainly not healthy. And a better solution is usually therefore to set a much shorter time limit, although recognise that students need extra time if they're going to photograph or scan in and then upload handwritten work. Or alternatively, set much longer deadlines of several days or a week or something, especially where the task is more suited, it's more open-ended activity, and to think about more imaginative ways of assessing than just conventional closed book exams.
Okay, thanks, David. I think that sort of concludes all the questions we've got. Now, from an accreditation team's point of view, we would love to share plans and provide reassurance by sharing what people are doing and best practice or good practice. So please do get in contact with Kim Smith, smithki@rsc.org, and share those. We can't share them without your permission though. So please do try and give that if you can. And I suppose the final thoughts from me, we at the RSC, we're not out to remove accreditation from hard-pressed departments at all. That's the last thing we want to do, and we want to work with departments. But we do have a duty to support students and future employers in their careers to ensure the standards are there. And we are always here to help. You can chat to us, you can contact us at any point by email or just pick the phone up or any media communication at all. Just don't stew on it or anything. Just please contact us. Finally, from me, a big thank you to the Committee for Accreditation and the rest of the assessors, and especially to David, who's participated today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby.